Hey friend, Graham here from recordingrevolution.com. And so we're talking about real versus fake. Last week we talked about real instruments versus virtual instruments and VSTs. But one of the things I talked about, one of the instruments that I don't think you can fake very convincingly is the guitar. But what I don't necessarily mean is the guitar amp. And that's sort of a question within the question. And I get this a lot, and I got this last week. Hey, what are your thoughts on miking up a real guitar amp versus playing through a guitar amp simulator, whether a plug-in or a box? Now, this question has existed for years, right? Over 10 years ago, before I even started this channel, this was a question I was getting back then. At the time, virtual amps were newer as a concept. The pod from Line 6 has been around for like 20 years. I mean, these things were pioneers back in the day, and now they're commonplace. So what I thought I would do today is talk about, but mostly show you the difference, right? There are more and more big-named artists who are at least being honest about the fact that they're using virtual amps, guitar amp simulators, both live and in the studio. I know guitar players who are playing through either Pod HDs or Avid 11 racks or Kempers or whatever it is, but especially in the recording studio with so many plugins now that you have the freedom to play around with different sounds, get impulse responses, virtual cabinets, virtual microphones, and we'll show you some of that as well. Can you get a convincing sound with the plugin? Well, let's take a look at the difference between a real amp and a virtual amp. Today I'm playing through one of my Fender Tellies and playing through a Vox AC15, which is a classic tube amplifier, an old faithful of mine. It's the same thing as the AC30, just less wattage, great sort of chimey, clear tone. And I'm miking it up with a Shure SM57, which is a classic guitar amp microphone. It's a dynamic microphone. You can get it for less than $100. And one little tip, when you're miking up guitar amps, I prefer dynamic microphones over, let's say, a condenser microphone, like a vocal microphone, just because they're a little more rounded in tone. They lop off some of the ultra high end, so it's a little more focused of a sound, a little more mid-rangey, which is where your electric guitar amp is going to live anyway, is mid-range. And it can handle the high pressure, so you can put that microphone right up on the cabinet. It can handle super loud amp, as we're going to hear in a minute. It may not be loud for you, but in the room it's loud, because to get a tube amp to sound good, you typically want to crank it up, or at least crank it through the gain channel and get as much of that tube saturation as you can. So we'll record a little bit of this, and then we'll play with a virtual amp and compare the two. And just a heads up, this mic, the SM57, is plugged directly into one of my empty channels on my audio interface. I'm using a Focusrite Claret, which is my interface of choice, just plugging right into the microphone preamp there. You don't need phantom power with a dynamic microphone, so it's just plugged in, cranked up a little bit, and we're good to go. So now I'm in Pro Tools, and I've got IK Multimedia's Amplitube set up, which is a great classic amp modeling plugin. There are plenty to choose from. Go with whatever brand you like. But I'm just playing around with a bunch of different amps, and so I picked one. It's one of the British. It's a Marshall emulation, I believe, but they're hard rhythm preset. And I basically plugged my guitar direct into my interface through the instrument in, which if you have an interface that has a 1/4 inch input, most interfaces, even the ultra budget ones, have a 1/4 inch guitar jack input. And on the box or on the software, you have to switch it from line level to instrument level, or just make sure that it's on the instrument input. It's the same connection, 1/4 inch cable connection, but it's a different signal level. So instrument level is much quieter, so you'll get a higher boost if you plug it in and switch it to instrument level, and it acts like a DI box. So you don't need a separate DI box to plug in directly, because most interfaces basically have one built in. So that's what I'm using here on my Claret. And then that gives me a signal into Pro Tools. I instantiate Amplitube. I dropped the sample rate as, not the sample rate, the buffer size as low as I possibly can. With a Thunderbolt interface, you can go pretty low. So Thunderbolt 1, 2, or 3. The connection is super fast, so you can play through plugins directly these days if your computer is relatively up to date. This is a 3-year-old MacBook Pro. So it's really not that hard to play through virtual plugins these days. You just play with settings just like you do on the amp and find something you like. I'm going to record a little bit. This is somewhat similar. It's not the same amp model, but somewhat similar. We'll take a listen to what this sounds like, and then we will compare. Now you're gonna notice a couple things when you look inside your DAW. The real amp, especially since this was recorded through a crunch sort of overdriven sound, has this real nice, smooth, fat looking wave, right? It's compressed. That's what distortion does. It compresses. Whereas when I plug in direct, you see this super peaky looking audio wave. That's normal because what was recorded was just the clean signal, which sounds like this. Pretty dumb. But what we're hearing, what I play through on playback and what you're going to mix to or whatever is that guitar being played through the virtual amp and the plugin, so it sounds like this. If you're like me, you want to minimize your options, simplify your life, and save CPU power. So what I typically do once I've got the performance the way I want, I'll typically render this down so it'll print the audio through the plugin and give me like an actual wave to compare it to. In Pro Tools, you can just right-click on any track and do commit. And now I've got a brand new track with no plugin, because it's printed the audio through the plugin, and now you can see it's a much similar looking audio wave. What we are hearing does look very similar to the Vox or the real amp. In fact, what I'm going to do is just chop, line it up a bit more so it's similar to what I played the first time. And what we'll do is we'll switch my, where is it, solo mode to XOR so we can flip back between the two and take a listen. So here is the real amp. Fake amp. It's hard to compare in the sense that there's two very different tones. The virtual amp tone I chose has a lot more gain. It's a little more mid-rangey, whereas the Vox has a little bit less gain and has got a little more top-end fuzz. With simple EQ, these can become very similar. We grab an EQ on the real amp, and what we can do is roll off some of the top end here. Let's take a listen. And then on the virtual amp here, let's grab an EQ. I'll roll off some low end. Yeah, and I'm just sort of balancing the two. The virtual amp has so much gain that there's the low end is really chunky and like, so that's more of an amp thing. But again, that virtual amp itself has more girth and more punch and more power than the Vox, and that's could be the nature of the amp model. It could be nature of my amp in particular. The point is both of these are super usable sounds. Super usable sounds. They're just different because the amps are just different. I don't think you would really know that one is fake and one is real. In fact, I think the Vox sounds thin and fake. I would have thought that was the fake one. Whereas the one of the IK Multimedia with Amplitude, that sounds more like what I thought the amp would sound like in real life. The point is, virtual amps are just as usable as real amps. They have been for some time, and what I like about them for people like us in the home studio is twofold. It's faster to work with, so you don't have to mic it up, you don't have to plug it in, you don't have to have all these different cables. You just plug your guitar in, and you can start to cycle through different amps very fast, which is the second bonus. Is you and I don't have 10 different amps usually in our studio. Maybe you do. So having virtual amps at your disposal where you can cycle through different amps quickly and easily allows you to create that sonic landscape. The best records with guitars don't just have one amp, right? They have multiple amps because most studios have multiple amps, and we know to create a wide stereo image that sounds full and not flat, to have that three-dimensional space when you're talking about tones, is to not use the same tone for every single guitar part. Use a different amp everywhere you can. Use a different guitar if you can. So whether you have one guitar, multiple guitars, having a bunch of amps inside of a software package like Amplitude or whatever you like to use gives you that opportunity to create a more three-dimensional mix because you have different tones spread out across. So I'm a huge fan, a huge proponent of virtual amps. I think they are good enough now to convince the general public that it's a real amp. It's all about picking the right tone for your guitar, for the song, EQing it after the fact if you need to. And if you want to go buck wild, throw a virtual tube simulation or amp on there, or throw a virtual tape saturation plugin or tube saturation plugin on there and give it a little bit of extra girth. But they sound great these days. And like I said, 99 times out of 100, I'm playing through my Avid 11 rack or some plugin because it's faster, it sounds just as good, and I can get more sonic variety. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing to the channel. Before you go, I want to give you something. If you haven't already, grab my 6 Steps to a Radio Ready Song guide. You totally should, because you know what? Dorking out over guitar tones is one thing, one small thing inside of one of the 6 major steps and stages that every song goes through. So getting great guitar tone is important, but there's 2 steps that come before you even record a single note inside your studio. And there are 3 more steps that come after you've recorded everything in your studio. Sounds crazy, but it's true. And I want you to not skip a single step. Most home studio owners are doing only 3 to 4 of these 6 steps. And that's part to do with why their songs don't sound competitive on Spotify, on the radio, on Apple Music, or wherever their music is being played. So I want you to go through all 6 steps, know what they are, implement them in your song creation process so that you get a great sounding track. You can get this guide absolutely free. It's just on the link below. Go to radioreadyguide.com, download it, read it. It's a short read. Refer back to it every time you're making music. It will help a ton. Again, radioreadyguide.com. Enjoy it. Make some great music this week, my friend. I'll see you on another video real soon.